Good morning. We're still in the Gospel of Mark. We'll be in for a few more weeks. As we've been going through this series, I've talked about how the Gospel of Mark is written as literature, and I want to talk a little bit about that this morning. That when I say it's literature, I don't want you to hear I don't want you to hear fiction. What I want you to hear is the early church, the Christians, those who came to follow Christ. They knew the stories of Jesus. They knew the miracles of Jesus. They knew the teachings of Jesus. They would gather around and people would share teachings from Jesus. They would tell the stories of the miracles and they would be encouraged by this. And it wasn't for a few decades into the church that the Gospels were finally written. And so what the Gospel of Mark is doing is it's taking the stories of Jesus and putting them into a narrative, writing them in such a way that it is encouraging a church in a particular context, in a particular place. And when we look at the Gospel of Mark, one of the things we've talked about is Mark is being written to a Roman audience, Christians who are undergoing persecution under Nero. And so Mark highlights certain things in Jesus' life to draw a comparison and parallel with Nero. In the beginning of Mark, talks about Son of God. That's a common, there's a lot of things in parallel with Nero, Son of God, and came as a savior to the world. And we've kind of outlined some of these things. The reason I'm sharing all of that is because Mark was written to a particular group of people in a particular time. But that doesn't mean that it's not written to us today. But when we understand what's going on for the readers of Mark and how Mark is writing it and putting it together and highlighting different things, it helps us understand a little bit more what we need to be hearing today. And so you've got Christians undergoing persecution. They're Roman citizens, a lot of them. They're being persecuted and marginalized. People aren't shopping in their shops because they have a C on their shirt, a Christian emblem, so to speak. That people know that they're Christians. They're not going to associate with them. So they're feeling social pressure. They're feeling pressure of death, and they're feeling this persecution. And so they're reading these common stories of Jesus, and they're seeing the way Mark puts them together to encourage them to be followers of Christ. And as we read Mark, we're getting into this central narrative that starts in Mark chapter 8, verse 22, and goes through the end of chapter 10. This section is framed by these two stories of blind men being healed. And the question that we've been wrestling with in the beginning of Mark is, who is this? Who is Jesus? And it gets asked over and over again. You've got Herod asking, well, who is this guy? Who are people saying he is? And then you have the disciples who are with Jesus, seeing his miracles, seeing the demons listen to him and bow to him, seeing the winds and the waves become calm at his voice. And they're saying, who is this? At the beginning of Mark's gospel, you, the reader, you, the hearer of the gospel, you're already knowing that this is God returned as king. And so you already know the identity of Jesus, and you get to watch everybody else figure it out. And I love the way that Mark writes this, because he's getting most of his information from Peter. And who's one of the biggest, there's a Greek word here for Peter, but write this down. The word is buffoon. Peter is one of the biggest buffoons in the gospel. He's constantly messing it up. And I love the way Mark writes this, because if you're a Christian in the early church, who are the pillars of the church? Peter, James, John, and the other apostles. And you see them time after time after time getting it wrong. And so if you're struggling to follow Jesus perfectly, you're in good company. Like, that's the first message of the beginning of Mark. This first section of Mark is, if you're getting it wrong in following Jesus, you're in good company, because even the pillars of the church who walked with Jesus and saw the miracles, they continued to get it wrong. And it's almost written as comedy, because you see the way they respond to Jesus and you just have to laugh at them. To then turn the mirror back on yourself and say, okay, where am I a lot like that? And so we get to this point in Mark's gospel, and these, I just want to highlight a few things from the reading this week, where you look at the narrative and how Mark's writing it, and how he's giving certain words and he's highlighting certain places to draw your attention to things. But since we're 2,000 years removed from this, we miss it. You have things like in chapter 7, he's in this argument with the Pharisees about hand washing. And there's this point that he's making, that there's with this new kingdom that has come. And that's one of the other themes that we're following, is Jesus proclaimed the good news of the kingdom coming. And so often when we hear gospel, good news, we think about souls going rather than kingdom coming. But the gospel message of Mark is the kingdom has come near and you are a part of it. You have a king and you have a kingdom, and nothing else matters. And so when this kingdom comes near, it comes with a new kingdom ethic. And it's not about hand washing, but it's about what comes out of your heart. And he's drawing these teachings from Jesus. And he goes on to talk about what comes out of a person. This is in chapter 7, verse 20. He says, what comes out of a person is what defiles them. And you hear echoes of the Sermon on the Mount in this. But the Sermon on the Mount says, okay, the laws of Moses show a lot about what you do and what people see, but let's get to the heart matter. It says, what comes out of your heart, this is what defiles. It says, for it's from within, out of the person's heart, that evil thoughts come. Sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and defile a person. And so many things in this list, if you sit with each of them, you start to realize some of these things are just the waters we swim in. That a new kingdom ethic rises above the ethics of this world that say it's okay to be arrogant. It's actually applauded if you're arrogant because you're showing confidence. When you look at the Christian ethic, it rises above malice. Malice is not a word we use often, but the hatred that is thrown back and forth in our culture from one side to the other, Christians are called to rise above that, because it's not about hand washing, it's about what comes out of your heart. So what are you filling your heart with? So he kind of highlights some of these things where these kingdom ethics, but going into this next section in verse 24 through 30, you see this Gentile woman who basically says, hey, come and heal my daughter. And Jesus says, hey, the kids eat first and then the dogs. And this is a really weird passage, and it's hard to hear Jesus say this, but the basic point is the Gentiles aren't eating yet. I came to feed the people of Israel first, and her response to him was what? Even the dogs eat the scraps that fall off the table. And Mark sets up the stage of the Gentile mission of Jesus, that they will then be included in the kingdom, that Jesus came to feed, but it's the dogs who are fed later. And you can get into, is this offensive or not? But the point is, the Gentiles will be fed. And it's the audacity of this woman to say, yeah, but throw me a bone. And so it sets the stage to get into verse 31, where it says, Jesus then went into the region of the Decapolis. This goes back to chapter 5, verse 20, where the demon-possessed man was told, go tell your story. Tell the people how you used to be this way, but then you met Jesus and now you're this way. And so he went about the Decapolis, the 10 cities, and he shared the news of what Jesus had done in his life. And it's this scene of the Gentiles receiving the gospel that Jesus then feeds a multitude a second time. And you're going, why is Jesus feeding a second multitude of people? He's already done this miracle. But look for the imagery in this. It's in the context of the Gentiles that we have chapter 8, where Jesus feeds the multitudes. How many loaves? There's 7 loaves, verse 5. When you hear the number 7, what do you hear? Perfection. This isn't just a recording of the events, but there's layers of meaning on when these Gospels are written. They're writing with layers of meaning that there are certain numbers that you hear depth in. When you hear the number 12, you hear what? Israel. And so in this passage, you have Jesus calling people around the bread where there's 7 loaves, and then later it says how many basketfuls were left over. Perfection was left over. 7. And this idea of the Gentiles coming around, I'm kind of skipping through a lot of this. But the imagery here in verse 6, this is the early church imagery. When you go to in 1 Corinthians 11, where Paul is recalling the breaking of the bread at the Lord's Supper, he talks about how Jesus took, he broke, he gave thanks, he distributed. And the same order is here, that this is a passage that Mark is leaning on the Lord's Supper imagery, and he says, he told the crowd to sit down on the ground. When he had taken the 7 loaves, he gave thanks, he broke them, and he gave them to the disciples to distribute them to the people. That the imagery here is this perfection of the Lord's Supper for who? Who's the context? The Gentiles. And so when you look at the people of God saying, no, we are the separate people. We are the people that God set apart as special. We are the ones that God has chosen. Jesus is saying, hey, the body and the blood is perfect for all people. And the question that Mark is getting them to wrestle with is, remember who he's writing to. Mark is writing to predominantly Romans. And as they look at what it means to follow Jesus, they're following the Christ, the Messiah, who invites them to the table perfectly and say, you are welcome at the table no matter what is going on and no matter what your heritage is. This is where you come to find the perfect feast. This is the layers of imagery that's going on in Mark. And I want to keep moving on in this. What I love about this central narrative of Mark, starting in chapter 8, verse 22, you have the blind man at Bethsaida, and then I want you to put one mark there, and then go over to the end of Mark chapter 10. You have the blind man Bartimaeus in chapter 10, verse 46 through 52. In this section, between these two stories, this is what scholars call an inclusio, basically a bookend of the narrative. That when you're hearing these stories, you actually see these two alike stories, and it's these two stories that actually shape everything else you read. And the Christians didn't just read these stories once and go, okay, I got it. They kept reading it and kept reading it and kept reading it. They committed it to memory. They went back and listened for the imagery over and over again, and they looked at how they were called to be more and more like Christ. And this first story, the blind man at Bethsaida, from this story to the last story, you're going to see themes of Jesus calling his disciples to follow him. 3 times he's going to say, I'm going to die, and 3 days later, I'll be raised from the dead. 3 times he says this. Each time he says it, and it says he spoke plainly about this. Each time he says this, the disciples don't get it. And the whole time you're going, how dense are you? That Jesus is speaking plainly, I'm the Messiah, the Son of Man. I am the King who's come to take over the world, to regain my throne, and here's how I'm going to do it. Let me be very clear about this. I'm going to let them kill me. That's a bad plan. When you want to overcome powers of the world, when you want to win, how do you do it? Because when you're in a place where you're being marginalized and persecuted, you want to know how to win. When you're in a war, whether it be literal or cultural or whatever, whether it's just a tug of war of power and influence, no matter what kind of war you're in, there are certain ways that you win those wars. And Jesus says, let me speak plainly. And the whole time you're going, how did they miss this? Well, they miss it because sometimes you're blind and you just don't want to see. And so we get to this first story in chapter 8, verse 22. It says, they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he spit in the man's eyes and put his hands on them, Jesus asked, do you see anything? He looked up and said, I see people. They look like trees walking around. Okay, I want you to stop for a second. Put yourself in this situation. You're a disciple. You're a follower of Jesus. You've seen Jesus bring demons to their knees under control. You've seen the winds and the waves still at his voice. You've seen Jesus do all kinds of miracles. You've seen him raise the dead. And Jesus performs a miracle and it doesn't work. Anybody else find that odd? Okay, let's try this again, he says. Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, don't even go into the village. I want to tell you my stab at what's going on here. Sometimes Jesus speaks in miracles. Sometimes Jesus speaks in parables. I think Jesus is acting out a parable here. The whole question, and Mark, I think Mark's actually laying this out beautifully, that the whole question up to this point of his gospel has been, who is this? Can you see clearly who Jesus is? And while you watch everybody else wrestle with him, the question is, do they have eyes to see clearly who Jesus is? And Jesus says, let me show you who you are. I've rubbed mud in your eyes, now open them. You still don't see clearly. Let me try it again. And what I'm trying to show you here is that I think Jesus is laying out a living parable to show the disciples and to show us, the readers, that sometimes we have an idea of who Jesus is, but we don't fully see him clearly. And what we have at the end of this section in chapter 10, you have blind Bartimaeus, completely blind, throwing off his cloak and running to Jesus. And the imagery there is, while everybody else, the disciples who have missed who Jesus is 3 times when he speaks plainly about his identity, they don't get it. But you have this blind guy who can truly see, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And he runs to him. And the imagery here is this blind man can see while everybody else who thinks they can see are actually blind. And Mark is putting the story together to then ask you this question: do you have the Messiah you want? Or do you have the Messiah you have? Because this next section goes into this. Jesus and his disciples went on the villages around Caesarea Philippi. It says, on the way, he asked them, who do people say I am? And I want to stop here for a second. Pay attention to every time it says on the way or on the road. The word there in Greek is actually the same word. The early Christians were called what? Followers of the way. Before they were called Christians, they were just called followers of the way. And Mark is playing with this imagery because they hadn't been called Christians yet. Followers of the way, and the central narrative is a transition from Galilee to Jerusalem, and they're on their way to the cross, and Jesus is saying, come and follow me. Will you follow me on the way? So pay attention to where that's happening. Who do people say I am? So some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets. And Jesus says, well, what about you? Who do you say I am? And Peter gets it. He says, you are the King. You are the Savior. You are the Messiah. And Peter, in all of his buffoonery up to this point, finally gets it right. Yes, Peter has it. And Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. And then he goes into this first prediction of his death. He says, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Why does Peter rebuke Jesus at this point? And here's the heart of the message this morning. Peter had the right answer, but the wrong application. It says, you are the Messiah, and in a war with Rome, you will dominate because you've got greater firepower, you've got greater, if they kill our people, you could raise them from the dead. If they besiege us, you can make you can multiply bread. Doesn't matter what goes on. If Rome can do their worst, but you've got greater firepower, you are the Messiah. When I look at our people, the Israelites, when I look at the power struggle of these political leaders, when I look at Herod, you will send them running because they are a joke compared to you, and they cannot withstand what you're about to bring to them because you will dominate them, and like the demons, you will bring them to their knees. You are the Messiah. In the culture war with the Gentiles and their terrible ways of living, you will bring them into submission under God's rule. You will establish perfect and proper morality and purity because you are the Messiah. And we will win the culture war of who's going to determine what happens and how we live in this land. The Messiah will reestablish proper purity, and everyone will see it. The Messiah will reclaim Israel as God's great and wonderful nation once again, and we will be the city on the hill that we have been called to be. We will be a light to the nations because you are the Messiah. And to that Messiah, Jesus then says, "Get behind me, Satan." Because if you want to win the war, if you want to win the battle, if you want to beat Rome, if you want to beat the political leaders, if you want to beat the culture, if you want to beat all of these things that are waging war against us, this is how you do it. Whoever wants to be my disciple, if you want to be my follower, if you want to be like me, you must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? And what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes to his Father's glory with his holy angels. There's a lot of people right now that are proclaiming a Messiah that will help you win in the culture war, in the war of politics, in the war of this nation, in any war and battle going on. But Jesus calls us to rise above that and to follow the Messiah who says, pick up your cross and follow me 3 times. And each time over this next week, as you read this, pay attention. He will say, hey, I'm going to die. This is what it means for me to win the victory over death, to win the victory over the dark powers, to win the victory over Rome and all of these different messes going on. For me to win the victory, I've got to die. And I want you to come and follow me. And they're going, excuse me, what, Jesus? Sorry, we were arguing over who is going to be greater whenever you come in your glory. And then he says, okay, to win the battle, to set the world free, to reclaim this place as God's, and for me to be on the throne, I must be lifted up and glorified. I must be king, and that's going to take the cross. And he says, come and follow me. And James and John come to Jesus and say, hey, can we sit on your right and your left when you come in your glory? Jesus says, you still don't get it. And so as we go into this next section of Mark's gospel, this central narrative, the question we're going to wrestle with is, what does it mean to be true disciples of Jesus in a world that hates you, in a world that wants you dead, in a world that marginalizes you? Jesus' answer is, pick up your cross and follow me. If you want to save your life, you're going to lose it. But if you lose your life, you're going to save it. How do you wake up every day and live for others, no matter what they're doing to you? That's rising above the power struggles of this world and saying, you can do your worst to me, because I know the one who sits on the throne. And that brings us to the final section I want to look at. And there's so much beautiful imagery here. Go and pay attention to Moses going up on the mountain in Exodus 33 and 34 and Exodus 24, where there's parallels here where the transfiguration and Jesus being glorified. There's parallels there, and there's parallels to the Ancient of Days in Daniel 7. There's lots of great imagery here that Mark's pulling from, but the imagery I want us to really hear is when Jesus is glorified, he is shining white in a way that is just showing absolute purity. This is a picture of the resurrection that is to come. That when all is said and done, Jesus has been resurrected. He has conquered death. He's come out of death on the other side. And this is the promise for you at your death. That when you were baptized into Christ, you were raised with Christ to be like him in his resurrection, to be glorified with him, with God, to be on the throne with the Trinity. When you come into the glorification of the resurrection, all will be made right. And so at the beginning of this section, when Jesus is trying to speak plainly to them about picking up their cross and following him, he's saying this with confidence, knowing that God is faithful in redeeming all things in death, in the resurrection. And so you see Jesus resurrected, and this is pointing forward to Revelation chapter 6, verse 11, where the martyrs, and remember, Nero is killing Christians at this time, and the martyrs are under the altar. The imagery here is the Lord's table with the martyrs under it crying out, and the imagery is they will be made white and clean. They will be given white linens to wear. The imagery here is the resurrection is coming, so martyrdom is not a big deal. And so when we grasp this image of the resurrection, what we're looking forward to at Easter, the transfiguration is pointing us to the one who sits on the throne, has ultimate power, and you don't have to have power in this world to be victorious. You can let go of that need for power and position because God will be victorious. Now, what I'm not saying is, I'm not saying we shouldn't stand up for truth. We should always speak truth to power. We see Jesus do this very clearly, but he doesn't do it in a way that gives him position over others. He always speaks truth to power, even if it kills him. And that's speaking truth to power in every situation, not only when it's politically advantageous. So I want to end with the words of Jesus, or the words of God here. In the mountain of transfiguration, there's a cloud, and out of the cloud comes the voice. And I feel like God's looking right at Peter, who just said, "You are the Messiah, but not that kind of Messiah." And God looks at him and says, "Listen to him. This is my son. Listen to him." You've seen the glorification. You know what is to come. Listen to him. So church, as we continue to walk with Jesus through the Gospel of Mark, and he calls us to follow him, to pick up our cross, to follow the way, I beg all of us, myself included, let us listen to him. Donald, come and lead us.